I observe in the systematic dismantling of the Scandinavian welfare states not merely the end of an era of socio-political experimentation, but the collapse of one of the most successful social orders of modernity. What has been unfolding over the past decade in Sweden, Norway and Denmark exceeds even the most pessimistic forecasts about the limits of the welfare state, and documents the structural impossibility of simultaneously managing mass immigration, demographic change and generous welfare systems. The irony is unparalleled. Those countries that for decades were regarded as models for a better society are today becoming warning signals about the dangers of utopian social policy. This development is taking place at the very historical moment when other European countries are still discussing the Scandinavian model as a role model, while its foundations have already eroded. The Nordic countries served as proof that high taxation and comprehensive social benefits could be compatible with economic success and social cohesion. This formula functioned in homogeneous Protestant societies with a strong work ethic, but collapses under the conditions of multicultural mass immigration and demographic transformation. The speed of this collapse surprises even critical observers. Within a single generation, Stockholm suburbs transformed from functioning working-class communities into lawless areas in which the Swedish police can no longer operate. What was trivialized as temporary integration problems has proved to be a systematic destruction of the foundations of Nordic civilization. The Scandinavian model was based on a unique historical constellation that no longer exists. High social homogeneity, Protestant work ethic, small population sizes and resource wealth created optimal conditions for comprehensive welfare states. These factors enabled the trust between citizens and the state that is required for high tax acceptance alongside low enforcement costs. Decisive in this regard was the cultural foundation of the janteloven, an informal normative system that subordinated individual interests to communal solidarity. This mentality developed in centuries-long isolated, largely homogeneous communities and enabled voluntary submission to high tax rates and extensive state regulation. The janteloven system functioned as invisible social control. No one should consider themselves better than others. Wealth was to be concealed, and collective interests outweighed individual ambitions. This mentality created the psychological prerequisites for redistribution on a scale that would be impossible in other cultures. At the same time, the Nordic countries benefited from favorable geopolitical circumstances. Sweden's neutrality during both world wars, Norway's oil wealth since the 1970s, and Denmark's strategic position between Germany and Scandinavia provided these countries with prosperity without corresponding costs for defense or reconstruction. The Scandinavian social democracies developed a specific model of the people's home society combining paternalistic welfare with democratic legitimacy. The state assumed comprehensive responsibility for education, healthcare, pensions and unemployment support, while citizens paid for this through high taxes and social conformity. This system functioned as long as the prerequisites remained stable. Ethnic homogeneity ensured low crime and high social cohesion. Protestant work ethic guaranteed high productivity and low rates of welfare abuse, and demographic stability maintained the ratio between contributors and beneficiaries. The first systemic crisis emerged in the 1990s, when high unemployment threatened the financial sustainability of the welfare state. Sweden experienced a banking crisis that caused GDP to shrink by 6% and unemployment to rise above 10%. This crisis forced initial reforms that moderately reduced the generous system. However, the real challenge arose from mass immigration. Since the 2000s. Hundreds of thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East changed not only the demographic composition but also the cultural foundations of Scandinavian societies. The janteloven system could not be transferred to newcomers who brought different values and expectations. Sweden today operates as a failed welfare state that has lost control over significant parts of its territory and is no longer capable of fulfilling fundamental state functions. Stockholm suburbs have de facto become extraterritorial areas in which clan structures and parallel societies prevail, while Swedish institutions are systematically undermined. The Swedish response to this crisis follows a typical pattern of Scandinavian politics: denial of reality through rhetoric. Stockholm continues to speak of integration and diversity, while gang violence explodes and no-go areas emerge. This cognitive dissonance between political discourse and social reality intensifies the systemic crisis. Particularly dramatic is the collapse of the Swedish education system. PISA results deteriorated continuously, while teacher violence and classroom chaos were normalized. Swedish schools in migrant-dominated areas resemble crisis zones more than educational institutions. Swedish crime statistics document social decay brutally. Rapes increased by 1,200% since 2005. Explosive attacks reach Lebanese levels, and gang crime controls entire districts. These figures reflect not statistical anomalies, but the breakdown of public order. The Swedish police systematically document their own powerlessness through the list of particularly vulnerable areas, a euphemism for lawless zones in which state authority has collapsed. More than 60 such areas already exist, with numbers rising. Norway presents itself as an oil-dependent corporatist state that masks its problems with petrodollars but develops structural challenges similar to Sweden. Oslo struggles with growing immigrant crime and social fragmentation but can afford generous compensatory payments due to oil wealth. The Norwegian strategy is based on the illusion that integration can be purchased through higher social spending. This calculation works in the short term but is unsustainable in the long run, as oil revenues are finite while integration problems intensify. Norway's sovereign wealth fund of over $1.4 trillion can finance migration-related social costs for several decades, but not indefinitely. Denmark acts as a pragmatic realist that, as the first Scandinavian country, has initiated substantial countermeasures against parallel societies. Copenhagen's ghetto laws and deportation policy for criminal foreigners demonstrate that Scandinavian politics is indeed capable of realism when political will exists. The Danish shift is not ideologically motivated but pragmatic. Denmark's social democrats recognized earlier than their Swedish or Norwegian counterparts that mass immigration threatens the foundations of the welfare state and responded accordingly. This candor made Denmark a model for other European countries. At the same time, Denmark's success in addressing integration problems documents the controllability of developments through political decisions. Ghetto lists, residence requirements for migrants, and stricter deportation policies noticeably reduced problem areas. This proves that Scandinavian problems are not inevitable but reflect policy failure. I identify in the current Scandinavian development three critical trends that go beyond integration problems and threaten the foundations of Nordic civilization. First, the demography welfare gap leads to the systematic unaffordability of the Nordic model. Aging native populations can no longer finance the social costs of growing migrant populations, while traditional solidarity mechanisms erode through cultural fragmentation. This development is mathematically inevitable. Sweden's birth rate stands at 1.8 children per woman for native Swedes, at over 3.0 for migrant families. At the same time, the unemployment rate of natives is 4%, of migrants over 20%. These figures document a transfer union from shrinking payers to growing recipients. Second, cultural balkanization intensifies into a systematic disintegration of social cohesion. Parallel societies develop their own norms, legal systems and social structures that are incompatible with Scandinavian values. The Janteloven system cannot be transferred to communities that bring individualistic or clan-based cultures. This cultural fragmentation manifests concretely in rising violence against women, anti-Semitism in Muslim communities, and the rejection of Scandinavian legal principles by migrant groups. Swedish rape capital statistics reflect not merely criminal problems but fundamentally different gender concepts. Third, the legitimacy effectiveness crisis is developing into an existential problem for Scandinavian democracy. Citizens lose trust in state institutions that evidently fail while politicians practice denial of reality. This credibility gap delegitimizes the entire Scandinavian social model. I project three probable paths of development from the current Scandinavian crisis. In the first scenario, continued political ignorance leads to the Lebanonization of Scandinavia. Ethno-religious enclaves establish parallel governments, while central state authority shrinks to ethnically homogeneous areas. Sweden becomes Europe's Lebanon, with competing communities and disintegrating state structures. In the second scenario, escalating systemic failure forces an authoritarian turn along Danish lines. Scandinavian governments implement drastic migration restrictions, bans on parallel societies, and policies promoting cultural assimilation. These measures stabilize the systems but fundamentally transform Scandinavian liberalism In the third scenario, demographic and cultural change leads to a post-Scandinavian transformation. Native Scandinavians become a minority in their own countries, while the traditional Nordic model is replaced by multicultural federal systems. Scandinavian civilization does not end through collapse, but through transformation. The macroeconomic data already document the systematic unaffordability of the Scandinavian model. Sweden's public expenditure rose to over 50% of GDP, while productivity stagnates. Particularly problematic is the explosion of social benefit costs for migrants. Swedish studies document that migrants from Africa and the Middle East cost on average 74,000 kronor annually more than they contribute. With 2 million migrants, this amounts to 150 billion kronor annually. At the same time, tax acceptance among ethnic Swedes collapses, who increasingly choose tax optimization or emigration. Brain drain exponentially intensifies the financing problems. Property markets in problem areas document the economic consequences of social disintegration. Property prices in Malmö Rosengård or Stockholm Rinkeby collapsed by 40 to 60%. What I recognize in the Scandinavian crisis is not merely the failure of specific policies but proof of the fundamental limits of utopian social models. The Scandinavian experiment was based on conditions that were not reproducible: ethnic homogeneity, cultural unity, and demographic stability. The irony lies in the fact that Scandinavian politicians destroyed their own successful models through mass immigration. Multicultural ideology and the welfare state are incompatible in the long term, as cultural diversity undermines solidarity. The coming decade will show whether Scandinavia finds the courage for substantial reforms, or whether it completes the path from social paradise to failed state. Denmark's example proves, rescue is possible, but requires realism, instead of ideological blindness. The Nordic model was a great social experiment, but failed experiments must be ended before they cause further damage. What I recognize in the Scandinavian crisis is not merely the failure of specific policies, but proof of the fundamental limits of utopian social models. The Scandinavian experiment was based on conditions that were neither reproducible nor sustainable: ethnic homogeneity, cultural unity, and demographic stability. The irony lies in the fact that Scandinavian politicians destroyed their own successful models through mass immigration. Multicultural ideology and the welfare state are incompatible in the long term, as cultural diversity undermines solidarity and demographic change threatens financial sustainability. The coming decade will show whether Scandinavia finds the courage for substantial reforms or whether it completes the path from social paradise to failed state. Denmark's example proves, rescue is possible, but requires realism instead of ideological blindness. The Nordic model was a great social experiment, but failed experiments must be ended before they destroy civilizations.